Hey there. So in this video, we're going to look at the bilateral blur node/filter that I've developed for Substance Designer and Painter, and some of the use cases that we can use for this type of image processing. Chances are you've run into instances where this node would likely fit the use case, but bilateral blur is not a very common household name. So chances are we've not been familiar that this technique even exists. So we're going to take a look at what it is first, and then we're going to get right into some applications. So what is bilateral blur? Well, the short of it is that it eliminates noise and it preserves edges. So realistically, what that's going to allow us to do is get rid of unnecessary detail, but also keep or preserve some detail of the larger structure of our image. So I've got this kind of, procedural grunge here, right? We've got a lot of different shapes and forms. We have a couple of, splotchy areas over here. We've got some larger shapes starting to take form here. And we also have some pretty defined, swoop brush strokes over here with some pretty defined edges. So in order to start to kind of simplify and remove some of the noise that we have here, our first option would be to use a blur grayscale node. We can see that it's starting to remove some of that noise at the cost of some of the detail that we would like to preserve, right? Some of these larger shapes. And if we go and really just increase the intensity of this, right, we're starting to really simplify it, but we're removing all of that really pertinent detail for defining the structure of our image. So this method is just not going to work. Another option you may choose to use is the non-uniform blur grayscale here in Substance Designer, which is a good option, but it comes with the caveat of having to first define that mask. And again, depending on the noise or the type of input map that you're providing it, that might require a lot of fine-tuning every time you plug something into it. So we can see I've just generated a normal, and then I have this curvature sobel, levels to just kind of invert that and only capture our interior detail. And then again, I'm just blurring that to kind of soften the transition, which is going to give us something like this. So again, we are slightly removing some of that interior noise, as we can see in here, if I click the right one, but we're still kind of, by and large, keeping a lot of that noise in there. However, it is a little bit more edge preserving than this was here. But again, this isn't going to work. And if we go and plug in a different noise, right, we have to start this whole process over to better fit just the information that we're providing with this new noise. So this is where the bilateral blur comes into play. It's going to take into consideration the areas that are relatively noisy but similar in value, and also preserve edges where pixel values are outside of the arbitrary threshold that we define in the node. So if we go and take a look at the node here, we can see very quickly, right, we've eliminated a lot of that interior noise. If I go back and forth here, but we're still preserving a lot of the edges of this detail. And if I come back up to these swoops, right, that had a very defined edge, we can see that for the most part, it is preserving that. Now, based on some of our parameters, right, we are kind of capturing some of that swoop in the blurring process, but that's where our parameters come into play here to kind of fine tune all that. And we're going to look at that later in the video. Timestamps are going to be in the comments. So here's a secondary example of a height map that we can alter using this bilateral blur. So here is the final output of this little node network where we've just inverted it. And we can see we've got some kind of cool detail here. And again, just inverted that final output so that we're getting this nice concave type of shape here. Now, if we zoom out, we can see that it's got a lot of larger structures to it. But as we can see in the 3D view here, and especially as we zoom in, it's giving a lot of smaller detail as well, which might, depending on our implementation or the application that we want to bring this into, be a little bit too noisy of a height map. So what we can do is taking our black and white spots one node here and running that through the bilateral blur. we can see what we've gone ahead and done is just simplified a lot of that, but keeping some of the larger structures. I'm going to just steal this connection and bring this in. And we can take a look now and see what it's doing to the final output of our 3D. So here is the before and the after. So it's really simplifying and kind of stylizing the overall detail from our texture maps, but it is preserving that structure and that edge detail, which is really cool that we can't get from traditional blurring techniques. So this is the strength of the bilateral blurring process, is that we can really start to remove the unnecessary detail that kind of plagues noisy images. So far we've only seen working in grayscale with the bilateral blur, but we have the option to go and work in color as well. So with the bilateral blur node selected, up in its parameters, if we just go and change the color space to grayscale, or sorry, from grayscale to color, you can see that we have the ability to work in color now. So I'm just going to run our image through this and plug this into our split viewer node. So the split viewer node is also a node I've done another tutorial on. Make sure to check that out. We look at using the pixel processor node as well as function graphs, but this is going to allow us to see the comparison between these two. So on the left-hand side here, this is the original image that we've got plugged in. And on the right-hand side, this is our bilaterally blurred image. So very quickly, we can see that we're able to kind of obfuscate or remove a lot of that noisier detail. If I just zoom in here very quickly, and you can see it also kind of presents somewhat of a painted, watercolor image, which is kind of really neat. And the bilateral blur node will have a bunch of parameters again to really tweak this and fine tune it to how we want. And so I also want to draw our attention to the ability of implementing masks, because sometimes when you're blurring something, you're going to want to remove an area from being blurred or mask off the blurring process to only a certain part of your image or your texture. So we can see here that on the left-hand side, this jar maybe is a little too blurred, and I'm just going to kind of remove that entirely from the blurring process. As well, this jar over on the right-hand side is not too bad. So maybe I'll just decrease the intensity of the blurring on this object here. So I've gone and created a very quick and easy bitmap mask here in Designer, with the left-hand side jar being painted black, which is going to entirely remove it from the blurring process, and the right-hand jar being a grayscale value. So anything between black and white is going to be at varying intensities of blurriness. And then of course, anything that is filled out in white is going to be 100% of the blurring from the node. Now you don't need to use a mask. I want to reiterate that fact, but if you want to remove or isolate specific areas, this is when you'd want to go ahead and do that. As we can see, the input socket for this mask is optional. So I'm going to go back to our image here and I'll plug this in. And now that's going to completely remove this left-hand jar from blurring. If we just take a look here, this is the original image, and this is our blurred one. It's going to blur the pixels around it, but nothing within the jar. And it's going to just kind of lightly consider this jar here. If actually I go and take a look at our split view, just a little bit of blurring is going on with this jar here. Now we can also see the intensity of the blurring from this output filter mask. So this is going to allow us to actually visualize the intensity of the blurring going on within our image here. So we can see this part has been completely removed, whereas this part is a little bit less intense on the blurring functionality. So now let's take a look at the parameter overview. So the first option we have for this node is, of course, changing the color space if we want to work in color versus grayscale. It's totally up to you. You can just use this one node and it's going to be able to do the process for whatever image you input. Now, the pre-blur section is a little bit of a misnomer because it is doing some pre-blurring calculations, but this section isn't doing this blurring that we can see in our grayscale image. What it's doing is it's taking the input image and it's starting to denoise it behind the scenes so that the blurring, the bilateral blurring function can start to find some of those pixel values to consider blurrable or edges. So we can think of this section as just kind of eliminating some noise prior to the actual bilateral blurring function taking place. So they're going to achieve really the same result, just at different levels. The denoise amount is useful for much smaller high frequency detail, where the pre-blur amount is greater for just larger blurring and larger scale noise across your entire image. So we can see that this pre-blur is going to really capture a whole bunch of noise very quickly, whereas this denoise, as we slide it up, is a lot smaller steps of pixel elimination. And now in the bilateral blur section, this is where the blurring and the thresholding and the edge detection is really taking place. So this value threshold is going to appear to work kind of similar to the last two sliders did. If I bring this down, right, we're not getting any pixels versus bringing this up more. And it's going to be kind of a balancing act between all of these sliders here, depending on your input image and the information that it has. But the idea with the value threshold is that this is determining for our function which pixels should be blurred and which pixels are edges. So the greater this slider value is, the greater the distance or the value distance between pixels will be considered in blurring process. So this is going to result in more pixels being blurred. Whereas if we decrease this threshold, right, we have a smaller distance that's allowed between pixels to be considered blurrable. So it's going to be a much noisier image, or it's going to be less blurred. Now our second option is the edge blur. So if I go ahead and zoom in, we can see that we're getting a lot of, nice detailed edges, but it's kind of resulting in a bit of a very contrasted grayscale image, which is really not going to work very well if you're using this as a height map. So we might want to go ahead and blur the transition between our edge and the blurred faces of this image. So this edge blur is going to start to kind of eliminate or soften that transition at the cost of kind of removing some of that detail there. So again, it's going to be a bit of a balancing act. You may need to turn your threshold down and then bring your edge blur up, depending on what it is you're actually working with here, so that you're getting a nice height map with nice edges. And then finally, the final blur slider, as the name suggests, is the final output blur of these pixels that we can see in our 2D view. So with a value of 0, this is going to be our original image. And as we increase this up, this is where we're going to be able to start to change that intensity of the blur. Now, if I bring this up to something like 5, right, it starts to kind of smooth things out and make it more of one uniform value. But I generally tend to stick around a value of 1 or maybe 2. But the needs of your image might be different than the needs of mine. So over here in Substance Painter, if you haven't checked out the designer portion, don't worry about it. We're going to cover what this can do in Painter as well. But first, we want to go up to File and import this resource. And let's go to Add Resources. And make sure that you go and select the Painter version. These two do have a little bit of difference between them, unfortunately, just because of the nature of what Painter accepts for filters. So just make sure that you have the Painter version selected. So we can open that up. And let's go and place this in the filter folder there. And I'm just going to put mine in current session. So that's going to bring in our bilateral blur. Now with this filter, we have to go and drag and drop this above whatever information we have in our layers. So the way that this bilateral blur filter works is that it needs information to be able to actually do its job. If you don't give it any information, it has nothing to process on, and therefore it's not going to output anything on its own. So we can see very quickly, right, that enabling and disabling this is going to rapidly change the look of our material here. And I've just got a nice, creature teeth smart material applied to it. And in order to see the parameters, we actually have to click on this little filter layer. Under parameters and global control, we're going to have all the same options that we did in the Substance Designer node here. We've got this pre-blur denoise, which is going to help remove a lot of that smaller scale noise. We've got this pre-blur, which is going to help us eliminate a lot more than that. And again, we're going to want to use those in conjunction with one another. And then the value threshold. So if I zoom in here a little bit and we take a look, this is going to now start to accept greater distances of pixels into the blurring process. And when I say greater distance, I mean their value distance. So a higher value on this slider means more pixels will be blurred, and a lower value means that we're keeping the threshold pretty low. So say I set this to something like 0.3. Maybe I'll bring the pre-blur up just a little bit. And maybe I'll bring the final blur to something like 2. So that's starting to really develop an interesting and cool stylized effect. And if we take a quick run through of our channels here, we can see what's going on is that it's starting to do this process across all of the channels. Again, you can change this by going up here and just deselecting this from affecting that channel. But we'll notice that we're starting to kind of eliminate a lot of that normal information or that height information. And actually, if I come back to our normal plus height, right, we don't really have anything at all. And while it's really nice that it blurred all of this stuff, we don't want it to remove everything. We want to have some control over, kind of bringing back some of this information. What we can do is come on over to channel overrides, and this will allow us to override this global control on a per channel basis. Let's go and select height. And I'm going to just remove the denoise a little bit on this. Maybe take the threshold back down. There we go. So we can see that this is starting to introduce back some of that height. So we're going to have to be pretty particular there. So that's starting to look a lot better, right? We went from nothing to getting some of this detail back. Now, if you feel like some of the channels also don't have enough blurring, you can go ahead and say we come over to our roughness, override this, and start to even blur this more. So again, it's really up to you how much you want to go into each one of these channels, but you have the ability to control each individual channel, as well as controlling the blurring process across everything entirely. So each one of these individual channel overrides are going to be additional to this global control here. And just quickly taking a look, here is what we had prior to the bilateral blur, and here is what we were able to end up with afterwards. And again, just for demonstration purposes, we didn't get too far into it, but I'm sure you guys are going to be able to do something way cooler with this than I could ever dream of doing. So that has been the bilateral blur. Hopefully you've learned a thing about what bilateral blurring is and seen some applications that are relevant to things that you want to be doing. This has been about, let's say, a year in the making, on and off. I'm just testing the filter in my own applications and trying to figure out how I could use this, because frankly, I think there is a really good application for this. I feel like I just haven't completely tapped into it yet. I'm not really sure. So that's why I want you guys to test it out. Take a look down in the description. I'll have the link to the Gumroad page where you can grab this. And please use the comment section of this video as the feedback forum for this. If you have ideas of directions that I could take this, or if there's bugs, things that just don't work as expected or don't work at all, please let me know down below. I will be actively moderating and taking a look at this so that we can try and make this the best type of whatever this is for designer and painter, so that people are just really excited about this node. So thanks for checking out this video. Again, happy to answer any questions that pop up along the way. Let me know. Catch you guys later.